In the dusty auction yard of Cedar Falls, Texas, a pregnant widow stood beside a weathered ranch house, her fate tied to the highest bidder. Cora Bellamy clutched her shawl tighter as men discussed her late husband's property, and her, as if she were livestock. The ruthless cattle baron Marcus Holt was moments from claiming both when a stranger in a black coat stepped forward. Westcott's quiet voice cut through the crowd like steel through silk, his single bid silencing every soul present. He'd won more than land that day. He'd won a woman's freedom, though she didn't know it yet. As the dust settled and papers changed hands, Cora wondered if she'd simply traded one prison for another. But sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, wearing spurs and carrying secrets that run deeper than Texas soil. Would Graham's mysterious act of intervention prove to be her deliverance, or had she unknowingly stepped into an even more dangerous game? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The memory of that morning still haunted Cora Bellamy like smoke from a dying fire. 3 months ago, she had awakened to find her husband Samuel cold beside her, his weathered hand still reaching toward the bedside table where he kept his heart. Medicine. The doctor said his heart had simply given out. Too many years of hard work, too much stress over mounting debts, too little hope for the future they'd once dreamed of building together. She twisted the thin gold band on her finger, feeling how it had worn smooth over their 8 years of marriage. Samuel had carved it himself from a nugget he'd found in the creek that ran through their property, back when they still believed the land would provide for them, back when they thought love and determination were enough to make a life bloom. In the harsh Texas soil, the ranch house creaked around her now as evening settled over the rolling plains. Every board, every nail told a story of their shared labor. Samuel had built this place with his own hands, rising before dawn to work the construction sites in town, then coming home to frame walls and lay floorboards by lamplight. She had painted every room, sewn every curtain, planted every flower in the kitchen garden that now grew wild with neglect. Their bedroom still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she'd made from herbs grown in that same garden. The scent should have been comforting, but instead it reminded her of all the nights she'd waited for Samuel to come to bed, his shoulders bent with worry over ledgers that never seemed to balance. The cattle had died in the harsh winter too. Years back, the crops had failed when the rains didn't come. One by one, they'd sold off pieces of their dream. The good horses, the breeding stock, the tools Samuel had saved for years to buy. She pressed her hand to the gentle swell of her belly, feeling the flutter of life that had become more pronounced. Each day, this child had been their last hope, their promise to each other that somehow they'd find a way through the darkness. Samuel had cried when she told him, actual tears streaming down his sun-weathered face as he held her close and whispered about the cradle he'd build, the stories he'd tell, the legacy they'd leave behind. Now she was alone with that legacy growing inside her, and creditors circling like vultures over carrion. The auction notice had arrived just 2 weeks after the funeral, delivered by a nervous clerk who couldn't meet her eyes. The bank held the mortgage. The feed store held liens on the equipment. The doctor who'd tended Samuel's final illness had a bill that needed settling. Add it all together, and the sum was more than she could hope to earn in a lifetime of taking in washing or teaching school. If anyone would hire a pregnant widow for such work, she'd tried to contest it, of course, had ridden into town in her good dress to sit in the lawyer's office and plead her case. But the law was clear as the Texas sky. She had no legal right to property that had been in her husband's name. The fact that she'd worked beside him every day, that her hands had helped build every fence and plant every seed, meant nothing in the eyes of men who'd never calloused their palms with honest labor. The worst part wasn't losing the land. The worst part was discovering that Marcus Holt had been circling like a buzzard for months, talking to the creditors, offering to buy up their debts at a discount in exchange for first claim on the property. He'd made no secret of his intentions, regarding her either, A pregnant widow would make a fine housekeeper, he'd told his drinking companions at the saloon, grateful for the roof over her head, unlikely to make demands, and already proven fertile for future needs. The very thought made her stomach turn with something deeper than morning sickness. Standing in her kitchen now, she ran her fingers along the scarred wooden table where she and Samuel had shared their meals, made their plans, counted their meager coins by lamplight. Tomorrow, strangers would walk through these rooms, evaluating her life's work like livestock at market. They'd poke at her quilts, examine her china, calculate the worth of dreams, in dollars and cents. But tonight she was still here, still breathing, still carrying the future Samuel would never see but had died believing in. She wouldn't let them take that faith away from her, no matter what tomorrow brought. Graham Westcott had arrived in Cedar Falls like a shadow cast by a passing cloud, quietly, without fanfare, but impossible to ignore once you knew he was there. The townspeople first noticed him 3 weeks before the auction, taking a room at the Cattleman's Inn and paying for a month in advance with gold coins that caught the lamplight like captured sunbeams. He was a man who commanded attention without seeking it. Tall and lean as a fence post, with steel-grey eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Henderson, whispered to her friends at the mercantile that he was unfailingly polite, paid his bills promptly, and left his room so tidy you'd think no one had slept there at all. But there was something about him that made decent folks step aside when he walked down the boardwalk, not out of fear exactly, but out of an instinctive recognition that this was a man who'd seen more of the world than Cedar Falls had to offer. Biddy. Speculation about his wealth began when he purchased 3 horses from the livery stable, not the usual nags that served travelling merchants, but fine animals with bloodlines that spoke of serious money. Then came the visits to the land office, where he spread maps across the clerk's desk and asked precise questions about property boundaries, water rights, and mineral claims. Word spread that he carried his fortune in leather saddlebags that never left his sight, and that he'd made his money in land speculation out in California during the gold rush years. "Man like that don't come to a place like Cedar Falls without purpose," observed Pete Garrison, the blacksmith, as he shod one of Graham's newly purchased horses. "Question is, what's he after?" The answer seemed to come the morning of the auction, when Graham appeared in the crowd wearing a black wool coat that had seen better days, but still carried itself with dignity. He positioned himself at the edge of the gathering, close enough to hear every word, but far enough back to avoid drawing attention. His weathered hands rested on a pair of saddlebags that looked heavy enough to bend a man's shoulders. Most folks assumed he was there for the land itself. The Bellamy Ranch sat on some of the best grazing in the county, with a reliable creek running through it and timber enough to build a small town. For a man with Graham's rumored resources, it would have been a sensible investment. But something in the way his eyes followed Cora as she stood beside the auctioneer suggested his interest ran deeper than mere real estate. Marcus Holt had dominated the bidding from the start, his voice booming across the yard with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. His foreman and hired hands clustered around him like a pack of wolves, laughing at his crude jokes about what he planned to do with his new property. The other bidders dropped out one by one as the price climbed beyond reason, until only Holt remained, grinning like a cat with cream on his whiskers. That was when Graham stepped forward. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, quiet, measured, and absolutely certain. The number he spoke was so far beyond Holt's last bid that the auctioneer had to ask him to repeat it. When he did, reaching into those leather saddlebags to produce a handful of gold coins as proof of his seriousness, the entire crowd fell silent. Holt's face turned the color of raw beef. He spluttered and raged, demanding to know who this stranger thought he was, but his bluster couldn't change the mathematics of the situation. Graham had just bid more money than Holt could raise if he sold. Every head of cattle he owned, The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sound like thunder. After the papers were signed and the money changed hands, Graham approached Cora with the careful respect a man might show a wild bird that could take flight at any sudden movement. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of winter steel, and spoke in that same quiet voice that had silenced the auction yard. "Mrs. Bellamy, I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you home. I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding your future arrangements." She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and wariness, as if she couldn't quite believe her salvation had come in such an unexpected form. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, their voices already carrying the news that would be the talk of Cedar Falls for months to come. Graham Westcott had won more than land that day. He'd won the chance to right an old wrong, though Cora couldn't know that yet. As they walked toward the ranch house together, his saddlebags lighter by several pounds of gold, he wondered if redemption could really be purchased so easily. He was about to find out. The walk from the auction yard to the ranch house felt like the longest mile of Cora's life. Graham Westcott moved beside her with the measured gait of a man accustomed to long distances, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. She found herself stealing glances at his profile, the strong jaw marked by a thin scar that ran from his ear to his collar, the way his eyes constantly swept the horizon as if watching for threats she couldn't see. "You must think me a fool," she said finally, her voice barely carrying over the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel road. "Standing there like a prize heifer while men bid on my life." Graham stopped walking and turned to face her, his grey eyes serious but kind. "Mrs. Bellamy, the only fool in that auction yard was any man who looked at you and saw property instead of a person. You conducted yourself with more dignity than the situation deserved." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such respect, such careful consideration of her feelings. Samuel had been a good man, but the weight of their troubles had worn away much of his gentleness in those final months. When they reached the front porch of the house, Graham paused at the bottom of the steps. "May I come inside? What I have to propose requires privacy, and I'd prefer you be sitting down when you hear it." Cora's hand instinctively moved to her belly. "Mr. Westcott, I appreciate what you did back there. Truly I do. But if you think that buying this place gives you any claim on me personally, ma'am." His voice carried a firmness that stopped her words cold. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I have no such intentions. What I'm offering is protection, not possession. There's a considerable difference." Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of it, made her believe him. She nodded and led him into the parlor, gesturing toward Samuel's old chair while she took her usual spot on the worn sofa. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains she'd sewn during the first hopeful year of her marriage, casting gentle patterns on the floor between them. Graham pulled a folded document from his coat pocket and placed it carefully on the small table between them. "This is the deed to your property, Mrs. Bellamy. As of this morning, it's legally mine. As of this afternoon, I'm prepared to sign it over to you, free and clear." Cora stared at the papers as if they might burst into flames. "I don't understand. Why would you spend a fortune just to give it away?" "Because I've learned that sometimes the most valuable thing a man can buy is the chance to do right by someone who's been wronged." Graham leaned back in the chair, his hands resting calmly on his knees. "But my offer comes with conditions for your protection and mine." She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "First, you'll accept my name as your legal guardian, until such time as you choose to remarry or your child reaches majority. This will prevent any future claims against your property and give you standing in court should anyone try to contest the arrangement." "Guardian?" The word felt strange on her tongue. "But I'm a grown woman, not some child ward." In the eyes of Texas law, a pregnant widow without male relatives has about as many rights as a child. This arrangement gives you legal protection while preserving your independence. His expression grew more serious. "Second, I'll remain on the property as your business partner. The ranch needs work to become profitable again, and that requires capital and connections I can provide." Cora's mind reeled. "You want to live here? In my house? I'll take the bunkhouse. It needs repair, but it's adequate for a man with simple needs." Graham's voice remained matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "Third, should you decide at any time that these arrangements don't suit you, you're free to ask me to leave. The property will remain yours regardless." She studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden price she'd be expected to pay. "What do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Westcott? No man spends that kind of money without expecting something in return." For the first time since she'd met him, Graham's composure slipped slightly. A shadow crossed his features, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Let's just say I once failed to protect someone who needed it. I won't make that mistake again." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken history and careful consideration. Outside, a mockingbird sang from the oak tree Samuel had planted the year they were married. "These conditions," Cora said slowly, "they work both ways." "How? Do you mean? If I'm to trust you with my home and my future, I need to know who you really are, Mr. Westcott. A man doesn't carry that much gold without a story behind it." Graham nodded, as if he'd been expecting the question. "Fair enough, but that's a conversation for another day, when you've had time to consider my offer properly." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Take tonight to think it over. I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer." As he reached the door, he turned back. "Mrs. Bellamy, whatever you decide, that deed is yours. You'll never be sold with this land again." And then he was gone, leaving Cora alone, with a legal document that represented either her salvation or the beginning of an even more complicated chapter in her already difficult life. That night, Cora sat in Samuel's old rocking chair by the window, watching moonlight paint silver patterns across the yard where she'd once scattered corn for chickens they could no longer afford to keep. The chair creaked with familiar comfort. As she moved gently back and forth, one hand resting on her growing belly while the other traced the carved armrests Samuel had smoothed with his own hands during the long winter evenings of their first year together. The baby stirred inside her, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribs. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Should we trust the mysterious Mr. Westcott?" She'd spent hours reading over the deed he'd left behind, trying to understand. The legal language that made her the rightful owner of the land she'd never dared hope to keep. The document seemed legitimate, bearing official seals and signatures that meant freedom from debt, security for her child, and a future that stretched beyond the narrow confines of other people's charity. But freedom always came with a price. The question was whether she could afford to pay it. When Graham returned the next morning, she was waiting on the front porch with coffee brewing and her decision made. He rode up on a fine bay gelding, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies, and dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than most folks spent in church. "Good morning, Mrs. Bellamy." He touched the brim of his hat with the courtesy she was beginning to recognize as natural to him. "Have you had time to consider my proposal?" "I have." She stood slowly, feeling the weight of the child she carried and the weight of the choice she was making. "I accept your terms, Mr. Westcott. All of them." Something that might have been relief flickered across his features. "I'm glad to hear it. I've brought supplies to begin repairs on the bunkhouse, if that meets with your approval." Over the following days, Cora watched Graham transform the neglected outbuilding with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything else. He worked from dawn until dusk, replacing rotted boards, patching the roof, and installing new windows that would keep out the Texas wind and rain. When she offered to help, he politely but firmly declined, suggesting instead that she focus on preparations for the baby's arrival. "A woman in your condition shouldn't be climbing on roofs or hauling lumber," he said, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man accustomed to having his judgment accepted without argument. She bristled at the presumption. "I've been working this land since before you knew it existed, Mr. Westcott. Pregnancy isn't an illness." "No, ma'am, it's not. But it's a responsibility that deserves respect and protection." His grey eyes met hers steadily. "I'd be obliged if you'd let me provide both." It was a strange dance they performed in those first weeks, formal and careful, testing the boundaries of their unusual arrangement. Graham took his meals in the bunkhouse, coming to the main house only when ranch business required discussion. He spoke to her with unfailing courtesy, addressed her as Mrs. Bellamy or Ma'am, and maintained a respectful distance that somehow managed to feel protective rather than cold. But Cora found herself watching him work, noting the way he handled tools with the confidence of long practice, the way he gentled the horses with patient hands, the way he always seemed to know where to find what he needed, even though he'd never set foot on the property before the auction. There was a story in the scars on his hands, in the way he instinctively positioned himself between her and any approaching strangers, in the careful way he never mentioned his past or asked detailed questions about hers. She began leaving fresh. Coffee on the kitchen windowsill each morning, close enough to the porch that he could help himself without having to knock. In return, she'd find small repairs completed around the house, a loose board on the front steps secured, a squeaky hinge on the chicken coop oiled, her garden gate fixed so it no longer sagged on its posts. They were acts of consideration, rather, than intimacy, but they spoke of a man paying attention to details that mattered to her daily comfort. Samuel had loved her deeply, but his attention had always been focused on the larger struggles, keeping the ranch solvent, planning for their future, fighting the battles that seemed to multiply faster than they could be won. Graham's quiet care for smaller things felt like a gift she'd forgotten she wanted. One evening, as she sat on the front porch, shelling peas for supper, she watched him curry one of the horses in the fading light. His movements were rhythmic and soothing, and she could hear him speaking quietly to the animal in a voice too low for her to make out the words. The scene had a peaceful quality that made her realize how long it had been since she'd felt truly safe. Maybe that was what Graham was offering. Not romance or passion, but the simple, invaluable gift of security. In a world where pregnant widows were treated as burdens to be disposed of, perhaps that was more precious than love itself. The baby moved again, stronger this time, and Cora smiled as she rested her hand over the spot where a tiny foot had kicked. Whatever Graham Westcott's reasons for helping her, she was grateful for the chance to bring her child into a world where they would have a home, a future, and a protector who asked for nothing in return but the opportunity to do what he believed was right. The photograph fell from Graham's saddlebag on a windy Thursday morning as he was unloading supplies near the barn. Cora watched it tumble across the dirt yard like a dry leaf, and without thinking, she hurried to catch it before the wind could carry it away entirely. The image that stared back at her was faded and cracked, a daguerreotype that had seen better days. A young woman with gentle eyes and Graham's same strong jawline smiled out from the frame, her dark hair arranged in the style popular before the war. She wore a simple dress with a cameo brooch at the throat, and something in her expression spoke of quiet dignity and inner strength, ma'am. Graham's voice behind her was carefully controlled, but she could hear the tension threading through it like wire through fabric. "I'd be obliged if you'd return that." Cora turned, still holding the photograph with careful hands. "She's beautiful. Your wife?" "My sister." The words came out clipped, final, as if he were closing a door on further questions. But something in his eyes, a flash of old pain that cut deeper than any physical wound, made Cora hold on to the picture a moment longer. "Sarah," he said quietly, and the name seemed to cost him something. Her name was Sarah. Was. The question slipped out before Cora could stop it. Graham's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. He said, "She died 5 years ago, in circumstances not unlike yours." The weight of that statement settled between them like stones in still water. Cora looked down at the photograph again, seeing now what she'd missed before. The subtle roundness to the young woman's face, the way her hands were positioned to hide what might have been the gentle swell of early pregnancy. Graham, she used. His first name without thinking, the formality between them suddenly feeling like a barrier she needed to cross. What happened to her? He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful distance of a man recounting facts rather than memories. Sarah was married to a rancher outside of San Antonio. Good man, or so we thought. He died in a riding accident when she was 6 months along with their first child. Left debts, same as your Samuel did, and no family willing to take responsibility. For a pregnant widow, Cora's heart began to beat faster, recognizing the familiar pattern of her own story. The banker who held the mortgage had a son, unmarried, with a reputation for... Graham's hands clenched at his sides. Let's say he wasn't particular about whether his attentions were welcome. He offered to forgive the debt in exchange for Sarah's hand in marriage. She refused. She tried to. But a pregnant woman with no money and no family doesn't have many choices in this world. Graham's voice grew harder, edged with a bitterness that spoke of old rage, carefully controlled. I was working a claim up in Colorado Territory when I got her letter. By the time I made it to San Antonio, the wedding was already planned. Cora waited, knowing there was more, and dreading what she might hear. I convinced her to run away with me. Had enough saved to take care of her and the baby. Enough to start over somewhere new. Graham's eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon. We made it as far as the river crossing before they caught up with us. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that didn't need to be spoken. The banker's son claimed she'd stolen from him, said she was trying to flee her lawful debts. His word against mine, and I was just a drifter with no standing in the community. Graham's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way of men who'd learned that feeling too much could break them entirely. They took her back, forced the marriage that same day to prevent any further scandal. And the baby, born too early. Sarah followed 3 days later. Graham finally looked at her directly, and Cora saw in his eyes a grief so deep it seemed to have worn grooves in his soul. I've been told that complications in childbirth are common, especially when the mother's been under considerable stress. The photograph felt suddenly fragile in Cora's hands, like holding a butterfly's wing. She understood now why Graham had appeared at her auction, why he'd been willing to spend a fortune to prevent her from sharing his sister's fate. This wasn't charity or business sense. It was penance. I should have protected her, he said simply. I failed, and she paid the price for my failure. I won't let that happen again. Cora studied his face, seeing past the controlled exterior to the man beneath, someone who'd been carrying the weight of his sister's death like a stone in his chest for 5 long years. She thought of all the small kindnesses he'd shown her, the careful respect, the way he'd asked for nothing in return for his protection. Graham, she said softly, offering the photograph back to him. You can't save your sister by saving me. His fingers brushed hers as he took the picture, the brief contact warm and surprisingly gentle. Maybe not. But I can try to make sure no other woman suffers what she did. He tucked the photograph carefully back into his saddlebag, but not before Cora caught a glimpse of something else that made her breath catch. A small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them what looked like a child's tiny knitted bootie. Sarah hadn't been just Graham's sister. She'd been his responsibility, his family, his reason for believing in goodness in a world that had shown him precious little of it. And now Cora was carrying that weight too, whether she'd asked for it or not. As Graham walked away toward the barn, his shoulders set in their familiar straight line, Cora pressed her hand to her belly and felt her child move in response. She was beginning to understand that her unexpected salvation had come at a cost. She was only now beginning to comprehend. not just to herself, but to the man who'd appointed himself her guardian against a world that viewed women like them as disposable. The question now was whether redemption could truly be found in the space between his guilt and her gratitude, or whether they were both destined to be haunted by the ghosts of what they couldn't change. The bronze bell of Cedar Falls Methodist Church had been calling the faithful to worship for 30 years, its voice carrying across the prairie every Sunday morning like a promise of community and belonging. But on the first Sunday, after Graham's arrival at the Bellamy Ranch, Cora felt that familiar summons with a mixture of longing and dread. She hadn't missed a service since Samuel's funeral, finding comfort in the rituals that connected her to better times, and the people who'd known her before grief had marked her so visibly. But walking into that sanctuary, with questions about Graham's arrangement hanging over her head, felt like stepping into a nest of hornets with honey on her hands. Graham had offered to escort her to town, but she'd declined, not yet ready to face the speculation that would surely follow their appearance together. Instead, she drove the buckboard alone, her Sunday dress carefully pressed and her spine straight with the dignity that had carried her through worse trials than small-town gossip. The whispers started before she'd even tied off her horse at the hitching post, living right there on the property with her, not even been widowed 3 months. That much money don't come from honest work. Cora kept her eyes forward as she climbed the church steps, nodding politely to neighbors who'd once invited her for Sunday dinner, but now watched her with the hungry curiosity of people feeding on someone else's scandal. Mrs. Henderson from the inn leaned close to the banker's wife, their voices dropping to urgent whispers that somehow carried farther than normal conversation. Inside the sanctuary, she took her usual place in the third pew, the same spot where she and Samuel had sat through 8 years of sermons about love, loss, and the mysterious ways of providence. The familiar hymns rose around her like embracing arms, but she could feel eyes on her back, could almost hear the questions that would follow her out into the churchyard once the service ended. Reverend Morrison's sermon that morning seemed chosen, specifically for her situation, all fire and judgment about the appearance of impropriety and the dangers of allowing worldly concerns to cloud moral judgment. When he spoke about the importance of protecting the community's virtue, his eyes found her face with uncomfortable frequency. It was during the closing hymn that Marcus Holt made his move. He appeared beside her pew as the congregation rose to sing, his bulk blocking her exit and his voice pitched to carry to the surrounding families. "Mrs. Bellamy," he said with false concern, "I hope you're finding your new living arrangements suitable." The way he said the word suitable made it sound like something that needed washing. Cora felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "Very suitable, thank you, Mr. Holt. Must be a comfort, having a man around the place again so soon." His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Though I do worry about what folks might think. A pregnant woman taking up with a stranger so quickly after her husband's passing." The singing around them faltered as people strained to hear her response. Cora felt the weight of the entire congregation's attention like a physical pressure against her shoulders. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the public test of her reputation and Graham's intentions. "Mr. Westcott is a business partner and a gentleman," she said clearly, her voice carrying further than she'd intended. "His conduct has been above reproach in every respect." "Business partner?" Holt's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "What kind of business would that be exactly? Can't imagine there's much profit to be made from a ranch that couldn't support its previous owner." Before Cora could answer, a new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like steel through silk. "The kind of business that's none of yours, Holt." Graham stood in the church doorway, his black coat and hat making him look like a shadow given form. But there was nothing shadowy about the way he moved through the crowd toward them, or the way conversation died in his wake like flowers touched by frost. "Mr. Westcott." Holt's confidence wavered visibly. Didn't expect to see you in church. Surprising. What a man might do when he has something worth praying for. Graham's grey eyes never left Holt's face, but his voice carried a warmth that somehow managed to include Cora in its protection. Mrs. Bellamy, if you're ready, I'd be honored to escort you home. The offer was made with such quiet dignity that even the most determined gossips would have trouble finding fault with it. Cora felt a rush of gratitude so strong it made her throat tight. She'd been prepared to face the congregation's judgment alone, but here was Graham, willing to stand beside her in front of the entire town. "Thank you," she said, accepting his offered arm with a grace that Samuel would have been proud of. "I believe I am ready." As they walked down the center aisle together, Cora caught fragments of whispered conversation that followed in their wake. Some of it was disapproving, some merely curious, but she also heard Mrs. Patterson tell her daughter that Graham had tipped his hat to her with perfect courtesy, and old Mr. Jenkins mutter that any man willing to face down Marcus Holt in public might be worth respecting. Outside in the bright Texas sunshine, Graham helped her into the buckboard with the same careful attention he showed everything else. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Cora found herself studying his profile. The strong jaw, the eyes that seemed to see everything, the hands that held the leather straps with competent ease. "You didn't have to do that," she said. As they drove away from the church, "People will talk regardless of what you say or do. Yes, ma'am, they will. But there's a difference between gossip and respect, and you deserve the latter." Graham's voice held the same quiet certainty she was coming to associate with him. "Besides, I've never put much stock in the opinions of people who measure a man's worth by how much noise he makes rather than how much good he does." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels creating a peaceful counterpoint to the morning's tension. Cora found herself relaxing for the first time since she'd walked into that church, her shoulders losing the rigid set they'd carried through the service. "Graham!" she said finally, using his first name again and noting how natural it felt on her tongue. "Thank you for standing up for me back there." "No thanks necessary, Mom. A man protects what matters to him." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. But as they turned onto the road that led home to the ranch, Cora felt something shift in her chest, a tentative recognition that perhaps Graham's protection was becoming something more personal than duty, and that her gratitude was growing into something that felt suspiciously like trust. The baby had been moving more frequently as autumn settled over the Texas plains, stretching and turning inside Cora with increasing urgency, as if eager to escape the confines of her womb and join the world waiting beyond. Dr. Matthews, summoned from town for her monthly examination, confirmed what she already knew. The child would arrive before the first frost, probably within the next 6 weeks. "Everything appears normal," he'd told her, packing his instruments back into his worn leather bag. "But you'll need help when the time comes. Labor's not something a woman should face alone, especially with a first child." The comment had stung more than it should have. Samuel had planned to be there, had talked endlessly about holding his son or daughter within moments of birth, about being the first voice the child heard besides its mother's. Now Cora faced the prospect of bringing new life into the world, with only the assistance of whatever neighbor woman might be willing to help, assuming any of them would brave the scandal of her current living arrangements. She was contemplating this lonely reality while hanging laundry on the line behind the house, when she heard the sound of hammering from the direction of the barn. Graham had been working on some project for the past week, disappearing after breakfast with his tools and a secretive expression that reminded her of Samuel whenever he'd been planning a surprise. Curiosity finally overcame her determination to respect his privacy. She walked across the yard, following the rhythmic sound of his hammer until she found him in the barn's side room, surrounded by wood shavings and the warm scent of fresh-cut pine. What she discovered took her breath away. Graham knelt beside. The most beautiful baby cradle she'd ever seen, his weathered hands moving with surprising delicacy as he sanded the curved rockers to silky smoothness. The wood was honey-colored oak, carefully joined without a single nail and carved with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers that must have taken hours to complete. "Oh," she breathed, one hand flying to her mouth. Graham looked up, and for the first time since she'd known him, she caught him looking almost embarrassed. "I hope you don't mind the presumption. I know it's not my place to—" "It's beautiful." The words came out thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "Graham, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." He set down his sandpaper and stood, slowly, brushing wood dust from his hands. "Your child should have something made with love, not just necessity. Every baby deserves that much." Cora moved closer to examine the cradle, running her fingers along the smooth edges and marveling at the craftsmanship. The headboard bore a delicate carving of a tree with spreading branches, and she realized with a start that it was the oak tree in their front yard. Samuel's tree, the one he'd planted during their first spring together. "You notice the tree," she said softly. "Hard to miss. The way you look at it sometimes, I figured it meant something." Graham's voice carried careful neutrality, but she could hear the question beneath his words. "Samuel planted it when we first moved here. Said every home needed roots, something that would outlast the people who built it." She traced the carved bark with one finger, amazed at how perfectly Graham had captured the tree's character. "He wanted our children to climb it someday, to have a tire swing hanging from that big branch. Maybe they still will." The quiet confidence in his voice made her look up sharply. "Graham, I know it's not my place to make assumptions about your future, Mom, but that child you're carrying deserves every dream its father had for it, and a few more besides." There was something in his tone that made her heart speed up, not the careful distance he usually maintained, but something warmer, more personal. She found herself studying his face, noting the way his eyes had softened when he spoke about the baby, the way his hands had gentled when he touched the cradle. "You'd be a good father," she said without thinking, then immediately felt heat flood her cheeks. I know what you meant." Graham's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you for saying it. There was a time I thought I might have the chance to find out." The admission hung between them, another glimpse into the life he'd lived before. Cedar Falls, before her. Cora wondered about the woman who might have given him children, about the dreams that had been lost along with his sister Sarah. What happened? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Graham was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on a piece of sandpaper he'd picked up from the workbench. "Her name was Elizabeth. We were engaged before I went to find Sarah. When I came back," he shrugged, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "She said she couldn't marry a man who'd choose family obligation over his responsibilities to her. Said I'd always put other people's needs before hers. She was wrong." The words came out fierce with conviction that surprised them both. "Was. She." Graham's grey eyes met hers directly. "I did choose Sarah over her. I'd choose family over convenience every time." "That's not a flaw, Graham. That's honor." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the wall he kept around his deeper feelings. "Your Samuel was lucky to have a woman who understood that. I think perhaps I'm the lucky one now." The words slipped out before she could call them. Back, hanging in the warm air between them, like a bridge neither of them had expected to build. Graham stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and Cora felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized what she'd just admitted. Before either of them could respond to the implications of what she'd said, the baby chose. That moment to deliver a particularly strong kick that made her gasp and press both hands to her belly. "Are you all right?" Graham was beside her instantly, his hands hovering near her but not quite touching, his face creased with concern. "The baby's just active today." She managed a smile, grateful for the distraction from the emotional minefield they'd been navigating. "I think he or she approves of the cradle." "May I?" Graham's request was quiet, uncertain. It took her a moment to understand what he was asking. When she did, she felt her breath catch. No one had touched her belly since Samuel died, had shared in the miracle of feeling their child move. The intimacy of the request should have shocked her, but instead she found herself nodding. Graham's hand settled carefully over the spot where the baby was moving, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. When the child kicked again, his eyes widened with wonder that made him look years younger. "Strong," he said softly. "Going to be a fighter, this one. Like its mother, I hope. Like both its parents." Graham's voice carried a certainty that wrapped around her heart like a promise. This child's going to have everything it needs to grow up strong and happy. As they stood there together, his hand resting on her belly and their eyes locked in a moment of perfect understanding, Cora felt something settle into place inside her chest, a recognition that the careful boundaries they'd maintained were beginning to crumble, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous than either of them had planned. The baby kicked again, as if blessing this new beginning, and Cora found herself smiling with a joy she hadn't felt since Samuel's death. Perhaps love could grow in unexpected soil after all. The riders appeared on the horizon like storm clouds, their dust trail visible long before Cora could make out individual figures. She was hanging the last of the morning wash when she spotted them, and something in their purposeful approach made her hands still on the clothespins. Graham emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing a broken stall door, his eyes immediately finding the approaching group. "Get inside," he said quietly, but with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Who are they? But even as she asked, Cora felt she already knew. There was something familiar about the lead rider's posture, the way he sat his horse with the rigid propriety of a man who considered himself morally superior to everyone around him. "Your husband's brother, unless I miss my guess." Graham's voice carried the flat tone she'd learned to associate with trouble. "Take the shotgun with you. Can you use it if you need to? Samuel taught me." Her mouth felt dry as dust. "But Graham, I'll handle this, Cora. Trust me." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such gentle certainty, gave her the courage to nod and retreat to the house. But she positioned herself at the front window where she could see and hear everything that transpired in the yard below. There were 4 of them. Samuel's older brother Jeremiah leading the group with his usual self-righteous bearing, followed by 2 men she didn't recognize who had the hard look of hired muscle, and trailing behind them all, Samuel's youngest, Brother David, who'd always been kind to her but never strong enough to stand up to Jeremiah's bullying. They drew up in front of the house in a formation that spoke of planning and purpose. Jeremiah dismounted with theatrical precision, his black suit and stern expression making him look like a circuit judge come to pass sentence. "You must be the drifter who's been taking advantage of our Samuel's widow," he announced, without preamble, his voice carrying across the yard with the volume of a man accustomed to being heard in church. "I'm Jeremiah Bellamy, Samuel's eldest, brother and rightful head of this family." Graham didn't move from his position near the barn, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his posture alert. "Mr. Bellamy, your reputation precedes you. Does it now?" Jeremiah's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then you'll know I don't tolerate interference in family matters. That woman in there is carrying my brother's child, which makes her my responsibility." Strange way of showing responsibility, letting her face an auction alone. The words hit their mark. Jeremiah's face flushed red above his high collar. "We weren't informed of Samuel's debts until after the sale. If we'd known, you'd have done exactly what you did do. Nothing." Graham's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. "Your brother's been dead 3 months. Plenty of time to check on his widow's welfare if family duty truly concerned you." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, and Cora noticed the way his coat bulged suspiciously over what was probably a gun. Her heart began to race faster, and she felt the baby respond to her distress with restless movement. "We're here now," Jeremiah said through gritted teeth. "And we're prepared to do our Christian duty by taking Cora back where she belongs, among people who knew and loved Samuel." "And where might that be?" Graham asked with deceptive mildness. "My home in Austin. My wife will care for her during her confinement, and after the child is born, we'll find her a suitable husband among our congregation." From her position at the window, Cora felt ice form in her veins. She knew Jeremiah's idea of a suitable husband, some broken-down widower in need of free labor, or worse, a man like the banker's son who destroyed Graham's sister. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the very idea. "Generous offer," Graham said, "but the lady's already made her choice about where she wants to live." "The lady?" Jeremiah's voice rose to near shouting. "She's a pregnant widow with no legal standing and no means of support. What she wants is irrelevant compared to what's proper. What's proper is letting a woman decide her own future, not when that decision involves living in sin with a stranger who bought her like a head of cattle." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge thrown down. Cora saw Graham's hands tighten into fists, the first crack she'd ever seen in his careful control. "Careful, Bellamy. You're talking about a lady who deserves your respect, not your slander." "Respect?" Jeremiah laughed, a harsh sound that made Cora flinch. "For a woman who moved another man into her marital bed before her husband's body was cold in the ground." This time Graham did move, taking 3 steps forward with the fluid grace of a predator. The hired men tensed visibly, hands drifting toward their weapons, but Graham's attention remained fixed on Jeremiah. "You'll apologize for that remark, or you'll leave my property. Those are your choices." "Your property?" Jeremiah's eyes gleamed with malicious triumph. "That's where you're wrong, stranger. I've got legal papers here that say otherwise." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, holding it up like a weapon. "Turns out Samuel's debts were even worse than anyone knew. This ranch was mortgaged twice over, and the auction sale was invalid due to incomplete disclosure. The real creditors are calling it in, and they've agreed to settle with family rather than pursue costly litigation." Cora's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the legal summons in Jeremiah's hand. Whatever arrangement Graham had made, whatever protection he'd tried to provide, it seemed the past had finally caught up with them both. Graham studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust anything that looked too convenient. "Legal papers can be forged. Real ones require proper service." "Oh, these are real enough, and properly served too, as of this moment." Jeremiah's smile was pure, vindictive satisfaction. "You've got 1 week to vacate the premises, stranger. After that, the sheriff will escort you off at gunpoint." The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Cora pressed both hands to her belly as she watched her carefully constructed new life crumble like sand in the wind. After Jeremiah and his men rode away, their threats hanging in the air like smoke. From a dying fire, Graham found Cora sitting on the front porch steps with her head in her hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, but neither of them seemed to notice the beauty of the golden light or the way it painted the oak tree in shades of amber and bronze. "They're going to take everything," she said without looking. "Up, the ranch, the baby, my freedom, everything Samuel and I worked for." Graham settled beside her on the steps, careful to maintain the respectful distance that had become second nature between them. But something in her defeated posture made him want to reach out, to offer the kind of comfort that went beyond words and legal documents. "They're going to try," he corrected gently. "That's not the same thing as succeeding. You saw those papers. They looked official enough." Cora finally raised her head, and Graham felt something twist in his chest at the despair he saw in her eyes. "I should have known it was too good to be true. Women like me don't get rescued. We get passed from one man's control to another's until we die or disappear entirely." "Cora," the sharpness in his voice made her look at him directly. "You're not property to be passed around. You're a woman with rights, with choices, with value that has nothing to do with what any man thinks of you. Rights? She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I'm a pregnant widow with no family, no money, and no legal standing. The only right I have is to be grateful for whatever scraps of protection men like you and Jeremiah choose to throw my way. Graham was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with words that wanted to come out, but that he wasn't sure he had the right to speak. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked as if it had been handled many times. I wrote this last week, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Never intended for you to see it, but maybe now's the time. Cora took the paper with hands that trembled slightly. As she unfolded it, she realized it was a letter written in Graham's careful script, addressed to her but never sent. Her eyes moved across the words, and with each line, her expression grew more surprised. My dear Cora, I find myself in the peculiar position of a man who intended to offer protection and has instead discovered something far more dangerous, the possibility of love. When I first saw you at that auction, I thought I was saving you for Sarah's sake, fulfilling a promise I made to a sister I failed to protect. But somewhere between watching you tend your garden and listening to you speak of your dreams for the child you carry, I've come to understand that my motives have become entirely selfish. I'm no longer protecting you because duty demands it. I'm protecting you because the thought of losing you has become unbearable. I know this complicates everything. I know you married Samuel for love, and that grief doesn't follow any man's timeline. I know I have no right to these feelings when you're still mourning your husband and preparing to bring his child into the world. But I also know that if I don't tell you how I feel, I'll regret the silence for the rest of my life. You deserve to know that someone sees you not as a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved, but as a woman worthy of the deepest respect and the most tender love. If circumstances were different, if you were free to choose without desperation, driving your decisions, I would court you properly. I would bring you flowers and ask permission to sit on your porch in the evenings. I would tell you stories about my travels and listen to yours about the life you built with Samuel. I would wait as long as necessary for you to decide whether a scarred man with more regrets than achievements might deserve a place in your future. But circumstances are what they are, and I fear that by the time you're free to choose purely from your heart, forces beyond our control will have separated us entirely. Know this, whatever happens with Jeremiah's threats or the legal challenges ahead, you are not alone. You have someone who believes in your strength, who admires your courage, and who would count himself the luckiest man alive if you chose to build a future that included him. With deepest respect and growing affection, Graham. When Cora finished reading, tears were streaming down her cheeks. She looked up at Graham, who was watching her with the vulnerable expression of a man who'd just bared his soul and was waiting to learn whether it would be accepted or rejected. "Graham," she whispered, "you foolish, wonderful man. I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still grieving Samuel, and I know my feelings are probably the last thing you need to worry about right now. But with everything falling apart, I thought you should know that whatever you decide, you have choices, real ones." Instead of answering with words, Cora reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with a boldness that surprised them both. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "It's exactly the right time." Graham stared at their joined hands as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Cora, I've been falling in love with you for weeks," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Every time you fixed something around the house without being asked. Every time you spoke to me like I had a brain worth respecting. Every time you looked at my belly and smiled, like this baby was already precious to you. It is precious to me. You both are. Then stop treating me like I'm made of glass that might break if you touch it. Stop acting like wanting me makes you a villain." Cora shifted closer to him on the steps, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used in her hair. "Samuel would have liked you, you know. He would have trusted you to take care of Bus. Graham's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tears on her cheek. Are you sure? Because once I start loving you openly, I won't be able to stop. And I need to know that's what you really want, not just what feels safe right now. Instead of answering, Cora leaned forward and kissed him, a soft, sweet pressure of lips that lasted only a moment, but changed everything between them. When she pulled back, she was smiling for the first time since Jeremiah's visit. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said. Now, what are we going to do about those legal papers? Graham's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. We're going to fight them. Together. The courthouse in Cedar Falls had seen its share of drama over the years, but rarely had the building buzzed with as much anticipation as it did the morning of the hearing that would determine Cora's fate. Word had spread through town like wildfire. The mysterious stranger who'd bought the Bellamy ranch was challenging the legal claim brought by Samuel's family, and half the county had found reasons to be in town that particular Thursday. Judge Harrison Caldwell presided from his bench with the weary authority of a man who'd spent 30 years settling disputes between neighbors, families, and business partners. His gavel, worn smooth by decades of use, rested beside a stack of legal documents that would determine whether love and intention could triumph over technicality and blood relation. Graham sat at the defendant's table wearing his best suit, his silver hair combed back and his expression calm despite the stakes involved. Beside him, the town's only lawyer, Mr. Theodore Walsh, shuffled through papers with the nervous energy of a man who rarely handled cases of such complexity. Cora occupied the chair behind them, her hands folded over her growing belly and her spine straight with the dignity that had carried her through every trial life had thrown her way. Across the aisle, Jeremiah Bellamy commanded attention like a general reviewing troops. His hired attorney from Austin, a sharp-faced man named Morrison, had spread an impressive array of documents across their table. The legal papers rustled with each movement, creating a sound like whispers that promised trouble. The facts are simple, Your Honor. Morrison began when called upon to present his case. Samuel Bellamy died intestate, leaving significant debts that exceeded the known value of his estate. The auction was conducted without proper disclosure of all encumbrances against the property, making the sale legally invalid. Judge Caldwell adjusted his spectacles and examined the documents Morrison submitted. These additional debts, when were they discovered? Our investigation revealed them within days of learning about Mr. Bellamy's death, Your Honor. Unfortunately, we were not contacted about the estate proceedings until after the auction had already taken place. It was smoothly done, Cora had to admit. Morrison painted a picture of responsible family members seeking to protect a grieving widow from legal complications beyond her understanding. The fact that Jeremiah had shown no interest in her welfare until after she'd found protection was conveniently omitted from his narrative. Furthermore, Morrison continued, we have concerns about the circumstances under which Mrs. Bellamy entered into her current living arrangement. A woman in her condition, facing financial ruin and social isolation, cannot be said to have made a free choice when accepting assistance from a stranger. Graham's jaw tightened at the implication, but Mr. Walsh rose before he could speak. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is impugning the character of both my client and Mrs. Bellamy without evidence. Sustained. Mr. Morrison, please confine yourself to legal matters rather than speculation about motivations. When it came time for their defense, Walsh's nervousness showed in his shaking hands and stuttered delivery. He presented the auction documents, Graham's proof of payment, and character references from several townspeople who vouched for Graham's integrity. But compared to Morrison's polished presentation, their case felt thin as winter ice. That was when Cora surprised everyone. By standing up, Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Caldwell frowned. Mrs. Bellamy, "You're not represented by counsel in this matter. With respect, sir, I'm the person everyone's talking about as if I'm not in the room. Don't I have the right to speak for myself?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jeremiah half rose from his seat, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "So is a family abandoning a pregnant widow and then claiming concern for her welfare," Cora replied, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "If it please the court, I'd like to tell my own story." Judge Caldwell studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Bellamy, but keep it brief and relevant." Cora walked to the center of the courtroom, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. When she spoke, her voice was steady as bedrock. "Your Honor, I was married to Samuel Bellamy for 8 years. I worked beside him every day to build our ranch, to clear the land, to care for the animals, to plant the crops that failed when the rains didn't come. When he died, I found myself alone with our child growing inside me, and debts I never knew existed." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Samuel's family knew he was struggling. They knew he was sick. They knew I was carrying their brother's child. But in 3 months, not one of them rode out to check on my welfare or offer assistance. Not until they learned that someone else had stepped in to help did they suddenly develop this touching concern for family duty." Jeremiah's face had gone from red to purple, but Judge Caldwell's raised hand silenced his protests. "Mr. Westcott didn't buy me at that auction," Cora continued, her voice growing stronger. "He bought me freedom. The freedom to choose my own future, to raise my child in the home its father built, to make decisions based on love rather than desperation. If that's not worth defending in a court of law, then I don't understand what justice means." She turned to look directly at Jeremiah. "You want to talk about family duty? Then honor your brother's memory by respecting the woman he loved enough to marry and the child he died believing in." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel for order, but Cora could see something had shifted in his expression, a recognition that the case was more complex than the legal documents suggested. "Thank you, Mrs. Bellamy. Please be seated." The judge shuffled through the papers before him, then looked up with the gravity of a man about to render judgment that would change lives. "This court will recess for 1 hour while I review all submitted evidence. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock for my decision." As the courtroom emptied, Graham reached for Cora's hand and squeezed it gently. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. "Brave or foolish, we'll know soon enough," she replied, but her smile suggested she had no regrets about speaking her truth, regardless of the consequences. During the hour-long recess, the courthouse steps became an impromptu gathering place for what seemed like half of Cedar Falls. Cora had expected to spend the time in nervous isolation, but instead found herself surrounded by neighbors she'd barely spoken to since Samuel's funeral. Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, was the first to approach. She carried a beautifully quilted blanket in her arms. Its pattern, a traditional wedding ring design, worked in soft blues and yellows. "This is for the baby," she said simply, pressing the gift into Cora's hands. "The church ladies have been working on it since we heard about your situation. Every stitch was sewn with prayers for your health and happiness." Cora felt tears prick at her eyes as she examined the intricate needlework. "Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say. It's beautiful. You don't need to say anything, dear. Just remember that you have friends in this town, no matter what some people might try to tell you." The comment was clearly directed at Jeremiah, who stood with his Austin lawyer near the courthouse doors, pointedly ignoring the growing crowd of well-wishers surrounding Cora and Graham. Pete Garrison, the blacksmith, stepped forward next, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he removed his hat. "Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Westcott, I wanted you to know that if you need character witnesses, there's plenty of folks here willing to speak up." "That's right," added Mrs. Henderson from the inn. "I've been watching Mr. Westcott for weeks now, and I've never seen a man conduct himself with more propriety." always tips his hat to the ladies, pays his bills prompt, and speaks respectful to everyone he meets. Old Mr. Jenkins, who rarely spoke to anyone except his horses, surprised everyone by clearing his throat loudly. Been around long enough to know the difference between a man and a scoundrel, he announced in his creaky voice. Westcott's got the look of someone who's seen hard times, but kept his honor intact. That's worth something in my book. One by one, others stepped forward to offer their support. The schoolteacher, Miss Emily Carter, spoke about how Graham had quietly donated money to buy books for the children of families struggling after the war. The minister's wife mentioned seeing him slip coins to the widow Thompson when she thought no one was looking. Even young Danny O'Brien, who delivered milk around town, piped up about how Graham always took time to ask about his mother's health and never failed to tip him generously. "I don't understand," Cora whispered to Graham as the testimonials continued. "How did all these people know to come here today?" Graham's smile was sheepish. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves a courthouse hearing. And when people hear that someone's trying to break up an arrangement that's brought happiness to folks they care about, and they care about me? The surprise in her voice was genuine. Since Samuel's death, she'd felt so isolated, so convinced that her situation made her an object of pity or scandal rather than genuine concern. "Of course they do," said Mrs. Patterson, who'd overheard the question. "You've been part of this community for 8 years, dear. We watched you and Samuel build your life together, saw how hard you both worked, how much you loved each other. Just because he's gone doesn't mean we've forgotten who you are." The crowd parted as Judge Caldwell appeared on the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable. "Court will resume in 5 minutes," he announced. "All parties please return to your seats." As they filed back into the courtroom, Cora felt buoyed by something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death, the knowledge that she wasn't facing this battle alone. The quilt in her arms felt warm with the love of women who'd taken time from their own busy lives to create something beautiful for her child. The promises of support from neighbors who could have easily chosen to remain neutral felt like armor against whatever judgment was coming. Graham walked beside her, his hand touching the small of her back in a gesture of support that felt as natural as breathing. Behind them, she could hear the rustle of clothing and whispered conversations as their supporters took their seats, creating a wall of community solidarity that even Jeremiah's stern disapproval couldn't diminish. "Whatever happens," Graham said quietly as they took their places at the defendant's table, "you've already won something important here today. And what's that? The right to be seen as yourself, not as someone else's property or problem. These people are here because they recognize your worth, not because they pity your circumstances." Judge Caldwell's gavel fell with a sharp crack that silenced the courtroom. "This court is now in session. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, I'm prepared to render my decision in the matter of Bellamy versus Westcott." Cora reached for Graham's hand under the table, their fingers intertwining as they waited to learn whether the community support they'd just witnessed would be enough to overcome the legal technicalities that threatened to tear their new life apart. Around them, the courtroom held its collective breath, waiting for words that would determine not just the fate of two people who'd found unexpected love, but the very principle of whether a woman had the right to choose her own future in a world. Determined to make that choice for her, the next few minutes would decide everything. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles, the weight of his decision evident in the careful way he arranged the papers before him. The courtroom was so quiet that Cora could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, each pulse marking another second of uncertainty. "This case presents several complex legal questions," the judge began, his voice carrying the measured authority of 3 decades on the bench. Questions of property rights, family obligations, and the validity of auction proceedings conducted under unusual circumstances. Cora felt Graham's hand tighten around hers beneath the table, Behind them, she could sense the entire courtroom leaning forward, waiting for the words that would determine her fate. However, before I render judgment on the matters before this, Court, I feel compelled to share information that has come to my attention during our recess. Judge Caldwell's eyes moved to Graham, and something in his expression made Cora's stomach clench with new anxiety. "Mr. Westcott, would you please approach the bench?" Graham released her hand and stood slowly, his face carefully neutral. But Cora caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever the judge wanted to discuss, Graham had some idea what it might be. "Your Honor," Jeremiah's lawyer interjected, rising from his seat, "if there's new evidence to be considered, the plaintiff has a right to—" "Sit down, Mr. Morrison. This doesn't concern your client." The judge's tone brooked no argument. "Mr. Westcott, during our recess, I received a telegram from Judge William Harrison in San Antonio. It seems he's been looking for you for quite some time." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, and Cora felt the bottom drop out of her world. A judge looking for Graham could only mean one thing. He was a wanted man, and everything he'd told her about his past had been a lie. But instead of the fear or guilt she expected to see in Graham's face, she saw something else entirely: resignation, mixed with what looked almost like relief. "Yes, Your Honor, I imagine he has been." "Mr. Westcott," Judge Caldwell continued, his voice now carrying a note of something that sounded almost like respect. "Judge Harrison wanted me to inform you that the charges against you in connection with your sister's death have been formally dropped." The courtroom erupted. Cora felt her breath catch in her throat as the implications of the judge's words sank in. Charges in connection with Sarah's death? What charges? Graham stood perfectly still in the chaos, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him like a soldier awaiting orders. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel repeatedly until order was restored. "Furthermore," the judge continued once the room had quieted, "Judge Harrison asked me to convey his personal apologies for the miscarriage of justice that forced you to leave San Antonio under such tragic circumstances. It seems new evidence has come to light regarding the death of your sister and her child." Cora watched as something she'd never seen before flickered across Graham's features, hope, tentative and fragile as a candle flame in the wind. "The man responsible for your sister's death, one Thomas Whitmore, was arrested last month in connection with another case involving the coercion of vulnerable women. During questioning, he confessed to several crimes, including his role in your sister's forced marriage and subsequent death." Graham's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from them. "Judge, Harrison also wanted you to know that Mr. Whitmore's confession included details about the forged documents used to claim you had stolen from his family's bank. The real thief was Whitmore himself, using his position to embezzle funds and blame others when suspicion arose." The pieces of Graham's story were falling into place like a puzzle Cora had never fully understood. He hadn't just failed to save his sister. He'd been framed for crimes connected to her death, forced to flee San Antonio as a wanted man. "Mr. Westcott," Judge Caldwell said quietly, "you're free to return to San Antonio whenever you choose. Your name has been cleared of all charges, and there are people there who owe you significant apologies." Graham turned slightly to look at Cora, and in his eyes she saw a question that made her heart race. He was free now, free of the guilt and legal complications that had driven him into exile, free to go anywhere, to start over, to build a life without the shadows of the past, haunting every decision, free to leave her if he chose. "Thank you, Your Honor," Graham said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he'd just learned. "But if it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to hear your decision about the matter that brought us here today. I have commitments in Cedar Falls that matter more to me than clearing my name in San Antonio." Judge Caldwell smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Cora had seen from him all day. "Very well, Mr. Westcott. Please return to your seat." As Graham walked back to the defendant's table, Cora felt tears streaming down her cheeks. He'd had the chance to walk away from all of this, from the legal complications, from the responsibilities he'd taken on, from her and the child she carried. Instead, he'd chosen to stay and fight for their future together. The hidden will that would change everything was still tucked away in the judge's papers, waiting to be revealed. But in that moment, Cora realized that the most important discovery had already been made. Graham Westcott was exactly the man she'd believed him to be, and his love for her was strong enough to overcome even the ghosts that had haunted him for 5 long years. The first pain hit Cora as Judge Caldwell was shuffling through his papers, preparing to deliver the final verdict that would determine their fate. It started as a tightening across her lower back, subtle enough that she almost dismissed it as tension from the long day in court. But when the second contraction followed barely 2 minutes later, stronger and unmistakable, she realized with a mixture of panic and wonder that her child had chosen this moment to make its entrance into the world. "Graham," she whispered, her hand finding his arm and gripping it with surprising strength. He looked at her in confusion, then followed her gaze down to where her other hand pressed against her belly. Understanding dawned in his grey eyes like a sunrise, followed immediately by something that looked remarkably like terror. "Now," he whispered back. "Here?" Before she could answer, Judge Caldwell's voice boomed across the courtroom. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented, including the discovery of additional documentation that has come to my attention." Another contraction, stronger this time, made Cora bite her lip to keep from crying out. The baby was coming, and it was coming fast. She could feel the familiar pressure building, the sense of her body preparing for the monumental task ahead. "Your Honor." Graham stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the judge's prepared statement. "I'm afraid we have an emergency situation here." All eyes in the courtroom turned to them, and Cora felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized their private moment was about to become very public indeed. The next contraction hit like a wave, impossible to hide, and she couldn't suppress the small sound that escaped her lips. Mrs. Patterson was out of her seat immediately, her medical training as the doctor's wife overriding courtroom decorum. "Judge Caldwell, this woman is in labor. We need to get her somewhere private immediately." The courtroom erupted into concern, murmurs and scraping chairs as people rose to help or simply to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel with more authority than usual. "Clear the courtroom. Everyone except immediate family and necessary personnel. Out now!" But even as people began filing toward the doors, Cora felt another contraction building, this one strong enough to double her over. Graham's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as she breathed through the pain. "We need to get you to the doctor," he said, his voice tight with worry. "No time," Mrs. Patterson said briskly, already rolling up her sleeves. "Judge, we'll need privacy and clean water. This baby isn't waiting for anyone's convenience." Within minutes, the courtroom had been transformed into an impromptu birthing room. Mrs. Patterson had taken charge with the efficiency of someone who'd assisted at dozens of births, sending Mr. Walsh to fetch clean linens from the hotel and ordering the bailiff to bring hot water from the courthouse kitchen. Graham knelt beside the makeshift bed they'd created, using the judge's robes and Mrs. Patterson's petticoats, his hand never leaving Cora's as she rode out each increasingly powerful contraction. The silver locket he'd given her weeks ago, his grandmother's locket he'd finally told her, caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall courthouse windows. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured, his voice steady despite the worry, etched in every line of his face. "Just breathe through it. I'm right here. Don't you dare leave," Cora managed between contractions, her grip on his hand tight enough to leave marks. "Promise me." "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," Graham replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. This baby's going to be born, knowing exactly how much it's loved. The labor progressed with startling speed, as if the child was as eager to resolve the day's uncertainties as the adults around it. Through waves of pain and effort, Cora was dimly aware of voices offering encouragement. Mrs. Patterson's calm directions, Graham's constant reassurances, even Judge Caldwell's gruff voice asking if there was anything he could do to help. "I can see the head," Mrs. Patterson announced with satisfaction. "One more strong push, dear, and you'll have your baby." Cora gathered every ounce of strength she had left and bore down with a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her physical body. She was pushing not just for the child she'd carried for 9 months, but for the future she and Graham were fighting to build, for the love they'd found in the most unlikely circumstances, for the right to choose happiness even when the world seemed determined to deny it to her. And then, with a rush that left her gasping and crying simultaneously, her daughter slipped into the world. "It's a girl!" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, lifting the tiny, squalling infant for everyone to see. "Perfect in every way." Graham's face, when Cora looked up at him through her tears, was a study in wonder. He stared at the baby as if he'd never seen anything so miraculous, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "absolutely beautiful." As Mrs. Patterson cleaned and wrapped the baby in the softest of the donated linens, Cora felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the physical relief of completed labor. Her daughter was here, healthy and strong, born into a world where she would be protected and loved by 2 people who'd fought everything from legal challenges to social disapproval for the right to build a family together. When the baby was placed in her arms, tiny fingers gripping hers with surprising strength, Cora looked up at Graham with complete certainty about their future. "What should we call her?" she asked. Graham's smile was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Hope," he said without hesitation. "Her name should be Hope." The courthouse had seen many dramatic moments in its long history, but none quite like the scene that unfolded. In the hour following Hope's birth, Judge Caldwell, his judicial robes sacrificed to the cause of bringing new life into the world, sat in his shirt sleeves behind his bench while Mrs. Patterson finished tending to mother and child. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting everything in golden light that seemed to bless the unusual circumstances. Cora lay on the makeshift bed, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Graham sat beside them, with the expression of a man who'd just witnessed a miracle. The chaos of labor had been replaced by a profound quiet, broken only by the baby's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the town going about its daily business. "Well," Judge Caldwell said finally, clearing his throat with the authority of a man returning to official business, "I believe we have some legal matters to conclude." Jeremiah Bellamy, who had watched the birth with the horrified fascination of someone seeing his carefully laid plans crumble in real time, stepped forward with considerably less confidence than he'd shown earlier. "Your Honor, surely these proceedings should be postponed until Mrs. Bellamy has recovered from her ordeal." "On the contrary," the judge replied, shuffling through his papers until he found the document he was looking for. "I think this is exactly the right time to settle this matter once and for all, especially considering what I discovered during our extended recess." He held up a yellowed piece of paper that looked official enough to command attention. "While Mr. Westcott was receiving his vindication from San Antonio, I took the liberty of conducting my own investigation into the Bellamy estate. It seems there was indeed a document that wasn't properly considered during the original auction proceedings." Graham tensed beside Cora, and she felt her own heart begin to race again. After everything they'd been through, was there still one more legal twist waiting to destroy their happiness? "This," Judge Caldwell continued, "is the last will and testament of Samuel Bellamy, properly witnessed and filed with this court just 2 weeks before his death." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Jeremiah's face went white. Then, Red, then white again. His lawyer began shuffling frantically through his own papers as if looking for some argument that could counter this unexpected development. "The will is quite specific," Judge Caldwell read aloud. "Samuel Bellamy leaves his entire estate, including all real property, livestock and personal effects, to his beloved wife Cora Bellamy, with the express wish that she be free to make her own decisions about her future without interference from his family or any other parties." Cora felt tears begin streaming down her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of pure relief. Samuel had protected her after all, even from beyond the grave. She looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully, despite the dramatic events surrounding her birth, and whispered, "Your father made sure you'd have a home, sweetheart." "Furthermore," the judge continued, clearly enjoying the shocked silence that had fallen over the courtroom, "the will specifically addresses the matter of debts, stating that any obligations incurred without Mrs. Bellamy's knowledge or consent should be investigated for fraud before being honored by the estate." Graham's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as the full implications of Samuel's foresight became clear. He'd known about the hidden debts, had suspected that people would try to take advantage of his widow's vulnerability, and had taken steps to protect her even though he couldn't have known about Graham's intervention. "Your Honor," Morrison tried desperately, "we'll need time to verify the authenticity of this document." "Already done," Judge Caldwell interrupted smoothly. "I've confirmed the witnesses' signatures and the date of filing. This will supersede any claims made by the deceased's family, and it certainly validates Mrs. Bellamy's right to enter into any legal arrangements she chooses regarding her property." Jeremiah looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. "This is impossible. Samuel never mentioned any will to me." "Perhaps," Judge Caldwell suggested with judicial dryness, "that's because he didn't trust you to honor his wishes regarding his wife's welfare." The words hung in the air like a verdict on Jeremiah's character. Around the courtroom, the few remaining spectators began to murmur among themselves, and Cora could see understanding dawning in their faces. Samuel had known his family well enough to protect her from them, which said everything that needed to be said about their true intentions. "Therefore," Judge Caldwell announced formally, "this court finds that the original auction was valid, that Mr. Westcott's purchase was legitimate, and that any subsequent arrangements between Mr. Westcott and Mrs. Bellamy are entirely within her legal rights to make. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, finalizing their victory in terms that no one could challenge or appeal. But even as relief flooded through her, Cora found herself looking not at Jeremiah's defeated expression or the judge's satisfied nod, but at Graham's face. "We won," she whispered, still hardly able to believe it. "We did more than win," Graham replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at Hope. "We became a family." Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly tidying up the medical supplies, approached them with something in her hands that made Cora's breath catch. It was a pair of simple gold wedding bands, their surfaces gleaming in the afternoon light. "I took the liberty of asking my husband to bring these from his office," she said with a gentle smile. "They belonged to a young couple who died in the influenza outbreak last year. With no family to claim them, the doctor thought perhaps they might serve a better purpose here." Graham took the rings with hands that trembled slightly, then looked at Cora with a question in his eyes that made her heart race faster than any courtroom drama ever could. "Cora Bellamy," he said softly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because the law requires it, not because society expects it, but because I love you with everything I am and want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." With her newborn daughter in her arms and victory still echoing in the courthouse around them, Cora looked up at the man who had saved her from despair and given her a future worth believing in. "Yes," she said simply, "1,000 times yes." The courthouse had seen many dramatic moments in its long history, but none quite like the scene that unfolded in the hour following Hope's birth. Judge Caldwell, his judicial robe sacrificed to the cause of bringing new life into the world, sat in his shirt sleeves behind his bench while Mrs. Patterson finished tending to mother and child. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting everything in golden light that seemed to bless the unusual circumstances. Cora lay on the makeshift bed, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Graham sat beside them with the expression of a man who'd just witnessed a miracle. The chaos of labor had been replaced by a profound quiet, broken only by the baby's soft breathing and the distant sounds of the town going about its daily business. "Well," Judge Caldwell said finally, clearing his throat with the authority of a man returning to official business, "I believe we have some legal matters to conclude." Jeremiah Bellamy, who had watched the birth with the horrified fascination of someone seeing his carefully laid plans crumble in real time, stepped forward with considerably less confidence than he'd shown earlier. "Your Honor, surely these proceedings should be postponed until Mrs. Bellamy has recovered from her ordeal." "On the contrary," the judge replied, shuffling through his papers until he found the document he was looking for. "I think this is exactly the right time to settle this matter once and for all, especially considering what I discovered during our extended recess." He held up a yellowed piece of paper that looked official enough to command attention. "While Mr. Westcott was receiving his vindication from San Antonio, I took the liberty of conducting my own investigation into the Bellamy estate. It seems there was indeed a document that wasn't properly considered during the original auction proceedings." Graham tensed beside Cora, and she felt her own heart begin to race again. After everything they'd been through, was there still one more legal twist waiting to destroy their happiness? "This," Judge Caldwell continued, "is the last will and testament of Samuel Bellamy, properly witnessed and filed with this court just 2 weeks before his death." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Jeremiah's face went white, then red, then white again. His lawyer began shuffling frantically through his own papers as if looking for some argument that could counter this unexpected development. "The will is quite specific," Judge Caldwell read aloud. "Samuel Bellamy leaves his entire estate, including all real property, livestock, and personal effects, to his beloved wife, Cora Bellamy, with the express wish that she be free to make her own decisions about her future without interference from his family or any other parties." Cora felt tears begin streaming down her cheeks again, but this time they were tears of pure relief. Samuel had protected her after all, even from beyond the grave. She looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully, despite the dramatic events surrounding her birth, and whispered, "Your father made sure you'd have a home, sweetheart." "Furthermore," the judge continued, clearly enjoying the shocked silence that had fallen over the courtroom, "the will specifically addresses the matter of debts, stating that any obligations incurred without Mrs. Bellamy's knowledge or consent should be investigated for fraud before being honored by the estate." Graham's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as the full implications of Samuel's foresight became clear. He'd known about the hidden debts, had suspected that people would try to take advantage of his widow's vulnerability, and had taken steps to protect her, even though he couldn't have known about Graham's intervention. "Your Honor," Morrison tried desperately, "we'll need time to verify the authenticity of this document." "Already done," Judge Caldwell interrupted smoothly. "I've confirmed the witnesses' signatures and the date of filing. This will supersedes any claims made by the deceased's family, and it certainly validates Mrs. Bellamy's right to enter into any legal arrangements she chooses regarding her property." Jeremiah looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. "This is impossible. Samuel never mentioned any will to me." "Perhaps," Judge Caldwell suggested with judicial dryness, "that's because he didn't trust you to honor his wishes regarding his wife's welfare." The words hung in the air like a verdict on Jeremiah's character. Around the courtroom, the few remaining spectators began to murmur among themselves, and Cora could see understanding dawning in their faces. Samuel had known his family well enough to protect her from them, which said everything that needed to be said about their true intentions. Therefore, Judge Caldwell announced formally, this court finds that the original auction was valid, that Mr. Westcott's purchase was legitimate, and that any subsequent arrangements between Mr. Westcott and Mrs. Bellamy are entirely within her legal rights to make. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, finalizing their victory in terms that no one could challenge or appeal. But even as relief flooded through her, Cora found herself looking not at Jeremiah's defeated expression or the judge's satisfied nod, but at Graham's face. "We won," she whispered, still hardly able to believe it. "We did more than win," Graham replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at Hope. "We became a family." Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly tidying up the medical supplies, approached them with something in her hands that made Cora's breath catch. It was a pair of simple gold wedding bands, their surfaces gleaming in the afternoon light. "I took the liberty of asking my husband to bring these from his office," she said with a gentle smile. "They belonged to a young couple who died in the influenza outbreak last year. With no family to claim them, the doctor thought perhaps they might serve a better purpose here." Graham took the rings with hands that trembled slightly, then looked at Cora with a question in his eyes that made her heart race faster than any courtroom drama ever could. "Cora Bellamy," he said softly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because the law requires it, not because society expects it, but because I love you with everything I am and want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." With her newborn daughter in her arms and victory still echoing in the courthouse around them, Cora looked up at the man who had saved her from despair and given her a future worth believing in. "Yes," she said simply, 1,000 times. "Yes." The weeks following their courthouse victory passed in a blur of new routines and growing contentment. Hope proved to be a remarkably easy baby, sleeping peacefully in the beautiful cradle Graham had crafted and waking only to eat or receive. The endless attention lavished on her by her besotted parents. Cora had never imagined that love could expand so completely, encompassing not just the fierce maternal bond she felt for her daughter, but also the deepening affection she shared with Graham as they navigated their new life together. Graham had moved from the bunkhouse to the main house after their engagement, though he'd maintained his gentlemanly discretion by taking the spare room until their wedding could be properly arranged. But Cora found comfort in hearing his quiet movements in the morning as he started the coffee, in the way he would check on both her and Hope during the night, in the simple domestic rhythms that spoke of a man committed to being a true partner, rather than merely a protector. The ranch itself was beginning to show signs of their combined efforts. Graham's business connections had proven invaluable in securing fair prices for their remaining cattle and quality breeding stock to rebuild the herd. His quiet efficiency with paperwork had sorted through the tangle of Samuel's debts and legitimate obligations, leaving them with a clear picture of their financial standing for the first time in years. "We're not rich," he'd told her one evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, "but we're stable. More than stable, actually. With careful management, this ranch can support a family comfortably." Cora had smiled at his use of the word family, still marveling at how naturally the concept had expanded to include all three of them. Hope slept in her arms, one tiny fist wrapped around Graham's finger with the possessive grip of a child who'd claimed him as her own from the moment of her birth. But it was more than financial security they were building together. As autumn deepened into winter, Cora watched Graham create new traditions that honored the past while looking toward the future. He'd carefully preserved Samuel's tools, explaining to her that someday Hope might want to know about the father who'd built their home with his own hands. At the same time, he'd begun adding his own touches to the property. A new fence designed to last generations, improvements to the barn that would make winter care of the animals easier, a kitchen garden plot where Cora could grow herbs and vegetables come spring. The most significant addition was the cattle brand he'd designed. When he'd shown her the drawing, a stylized tree with intertwined branches surrounding the initials C and G, Cora had felt tears spring to her eyes at the symbolism. "It represents growth," he'd explained, his voice carrying the careful attention to meaning that characterized everything he did. Separate roots growing together into something stronger than either could be alone. They'd registered the brand, officially the week before Thanksgiving, making their partnership legal in the eyes of both the law and the ranching community. Marcus Holt, who still controlled the largest spread in the county, had made a point of congratulating them with barely concealed irritation, clearly frustrated that his plans to acquire their land had been so thoroughly thwarted. "Fine-looking brand," he'd admitted grudgingly. "Though I still think a woman's got no business running cattle. Good thing she's not running them alone," Graham had replied mildly, but with steel beneath the polite words. "And good thing she's got more sense about business than most men I've met." The exchange had become the talk of the Cattlemen's Association meeting, cementing their reputation as a couple to be reckoned with rather than dismissed. As November gave way to December, they began planning their wedding in earnest. It would be a simple ceremony, they'd decided. No need for elaborate celebrations when the important business of joining their lives had already been accomplished in all the ways that mattered. Reverend Morrison had agreed to perform the service, and Mrs. Patterson had volunteered to host a small reception at her home afterward. "Are you certain you don't want something grander?" Graham had asked one evening as they discussed the details. "A woman should have the wedding she dreams of." "I'm having the wedding I dream of," Cora had replied, settling more comfortably against his shoulder as they sat before the fireplace. "Simple, honest, surrounded by people who care about us. What more could I want? A dress that hasn't been made over 3 times, he'd suggested with gentle humor. That had led to one of their few disagreements, a mild argument about whether she needed a new wedding dress when her best Sunday outfit would serve perfectly well. Graham had won that particular battle by pointing out that Hope deserved to see her mother married in something special, something that could be preserved for family history. The dress had arrived from Austin the previous week, a simple but elegant creation in ivory silk that managed to be both modest and beautiful. When Cora had tried it on for Mrs. Patterson's approval, she'd felt like the bride she'd never quite been the first time around. Young Samuel had been sweet and earnest, but their wedding had been hastily arranged and focused more on practical necessities than romantic dreams. This time felt different. This time she was marrying a man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to love her anyway, who'd fought legal battles and social disapproval for the right to build a life with her, who looked at her daughter with the devotion of a father who'd been present for her very first breath. 2 more weeks, she murmured to Hope as she nursed her daughter by the fire one snowy evening in mid-December. 2 more weeks, and Graham will officially be your papa. "He already is, in every way that matters," Graham said softly from the doorway, where he'd been watching them with the expression of quiet wonder that still appeared on his face whenever he contemplated their unlikely happiness. Cora looked up at him, at this man who'd saved her from despair and given her a future brighter than any she dared imagine, and felt her heart swell with gratitude so profound it took her breath away. "Yes," she agreed, reaching for his hand as he settled beside them. "He already is." The morning of December 23rd dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of the farmhouse and a sky so blue it looked like it had been scrubbed clean for the occasion. Cora woke before sunrise, not from nerves but from the pure anticipation of a woman about to marry the man she loved on terms of complete equality and mutual choice. Hope had slept through the night for the first time in weeks, as if even she understood the importance of the day ahead. Cora lifted her daughter from the cradle, marveling again at the perfect features that seemed to shift daily as the baby grew and changed. At 2 months old, Hope had already developed her own personality, alert. During the day, fascinated by faces and voices, and possessed of a smile that could melt the hardest heart. "Today your mama becomes Mrs. Westcott," Cora whispered as she changed and fed her daughter, "and you officially become Hope Westcott, with a papa who's already wrapped around your tiny finger." From somewhere in the house, she could hear Graham, moving around quietly, probably making coffee and checking the fire. He'd insisted on maintaining propriety even in their final days as an engaged couple, though the formality felt almost amusing now when they'd already shared so much more than most married couples of their acquaintance. Mrs. Patterson arrived before breakfast, bringing with her a team of church ladies who'd volunteered to help with the wedding preparations. They descended on the house like a benevolent invasion, filling the kitchen with the bustle of women who knew how to organize a celebration despite short notice. "Don't you worry about a thing, dear," Mrs. Patterson announced as she took charge of Hope with practiced ease. "We've got everything under control. Your only job today is to be beautiful and happy." The ivory silk dress fit perfectly, falling in graceful lines that flattered her still-changing figure while maintaining the modesty appropriate for a woman of her station. Mrs. Henderson had contributed her grandmother's pearl necklace, and Miss Carter had brought tiny pearl combs for her hair. When they were finished with their ministrations, Cora hardly recognized herself in the mirror. "You look like a princess from a storybook," breathed little Mary Patterson, who'd been allowed to help with the preparations as a special treat. "Do I?" Cora smiled at the girl's enthusiasm. "I feel more like myself than I have in a very long time." The ceremony was to take place in the parlor of the farmhouse, the same room where Graham had first proposed their unusual arrangement. Reverend Morrison had arrived early to prepare, and by noon the small space was filled with everyone who mattered to them. Neighbors who'd become friends, acquaintances who'd become supporters, and the makeshift family they'd created through shared adversity and mutual affection. Graham waited for her at the front of the room, wearing a new black suit that emphasized his lean strength and silver hair. When their eyes met as she entered the parlor, his smile was so full of love and pride that she felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't the desperate union of convenience she'd feared months ago, or even the grateful acceptance of protection she'd imagined when they'd first struck their bargain. This was the wedding of two people who'd chosen each other freely, completely, and with full knowledge of what they were promising. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate to the moment, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of Graham Westcott and Cora Bellamy in holy matrimony." The traditional words took on new meaning in the context of their unusual courtship. When the minister spoke of love and honor, Cora thought of Graham defending her reputation in the church. When he mentioned supporting each other through trials, she remembered the way Graham had knelt beside her during Hope's birth. When he talked about becoming one flesh, she felt the rightness of the choice they were making. "Do you, Graham, take Cora to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Graham replied, his voice steady and sure as he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. "With all my heart, I do." "Do you, Cora, take Graham to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Cora looked into his grey eyes, seeing in them the promise of partnership, protection, and passionate devotion that had already transformed her life so completely. "I do," she said, her voice clear and joyful as she placed the matching band on his finger. "With all my heart and soul, I do. By the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Graham, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and reverent, a promise sealed with tenderness rather than passion. But when they broke apart, both were smiling with the quiet joy of people who knew they'd just committed to something beautiful and lasting. As the small congregation erupted in applause and congratulations, Mrs. Patterson approached with Hope in her arms. The baby had been remarkably well behaved throughout the ceremony, but now she reached for her parents with the determination of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. "May I present the Westcott family," Reverend Morrison announced with satisfaction as Graham took Hope while keeping his other arm around Cora's waist. Standing there in the parlor where their story had truly begun, surrounded by friends who'd supported them through legal battles and social disapproval, Cora felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with love, freely given and joyfully received. She was no longer a pregnant widow being sold with a ranch. She was Mrs. Graham Westcott, mother to Hope, partner in building a future that belonged entirely to them. 1 year later, Cora stood on the same front porch where she'd once awaited an uncertain fate, but now she watched her husband teaching their daughter to take her first wobbly steps across the sun-warmed boards. Hope, now 14 months old and fearless as her mother, squealed with delight each time Graham caught her before she could tumble, her chubby hands reaching persistently for the wooden horse he'd carved for her first birthday. The ranch prospered around them like a testament to what could grow from the seeds of hope and hard work. Their cattle bore the intertwined tree brand that had become respected throughout the county, and their account at the Cedar Falls bank showed a balance that would have seemed impossible during those dark days before the auction. But more than financial security, they'd built something rarer and more precious, a marriage rooted in genuine partnership and a family bound together by choice rather than mere circumstance. "Mama, watch!" Hope's vocabulary had exploded in recent weeks, and her favorite word remained watch, usually accompanied by some feat of daring that made both parents hold their breath. "I'm watching, sweetheart," Cora called, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their second child grew. This pregnancy felt different from the first, anticipated rather than frightening, supported rather than solitary, embraced by a husband who treated each milestone as a celebration rather than a burden to be endured. Graham looked up from his daughter's attempts at independent locomotion, his grey eyes finding Cora's with the warm familiarity of a man who'd learned to read her moods and needs as easily as the weather. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Westcott?" The formal address had become their private joke, a way of acknowledging how far they'd travelled from that first awkward conversation about guardianship and business arrangements. She was no longer Mrs. Bellamy, the desperate widow clinging to the remnants of a broken dream. She was Mrs. Westcott, partner to a man who valued her judgment, mother to children who would grow up secure in their parents' love, and a woman who'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful futures grew from the most unlikely beginnings. "I'm feeling grateful," she replied honestly, moving to join them as Hope finally managed 3 consecutive steps before collapsing in triumph into Graham's waiting arms. Later that evening, after Hope had been tucked into the bed Graham had built for her transition from the baby cradle, Cora found her husband in his study updating the ranch records in the worn leather ledger that tracked their growing prosperity. She settled beside him, marveling again at how comfortable silence had become. Between them, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to that auction?" she asked. Graham set down his pen and considered the question with the careful attention he gave all her inquiries. "I try not to think about it," he said finally. "Some possibilities are too terrible to contemplate." He reached for the family Bible they'd begun keeping on the desk, its pages now recording not just Hope's birth, but also their marriage and the promise of new life to come. In the space reserved for family history, Graham's careful handwriting told a story that would, someday, help their children understand the extraordinary circumstances that had brought their parents together. "But I do know this," he continued, closing the book and turning to face her fully. "Whatever brought me to that dusty auction yard was the best fortune of my life. You and Hope, and this one," he added, placing his hand gently over her growing belly. You're my redemption, Cora, my second chance at getting love right. As they sat together in the lamplight, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built through determination, faith, and an unexpected love that had transformed them both, Cora reflected on how the human heart could expand to accommodate joy it had never dared imagine. Sometimes salvation came in the most unlikely forms, wearing spurs and carrying secrets deeper than Texas soil. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, it stayed long enough to become home.